Welcome to episode 238 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/238. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist that specializes in recovery from disordered eating and eating disorders, or really just helping anyone who has a messy relationship with food and body and exercise. And today on the show, it's another interview, but this one is a little different to usual. So a number of months ago, I received an email from an anonymous email address, and the email was entitled PTSD and ED recovery. And the email said, "I've listened to your podcast that talked about the unfortunately common co-morbidity of eating disorders and PTSD from sexual assault. I wanted to contact you to share an anonymous chronicle that I've just written that might help others. I've just completed prolonged exposure therapy for an historical sexual assault that had underpinned my eating disorder over many decades. I feel like my recovery from both conditions has finally truly begun." The attached anonymous chronicle describes the prolonged exposure therapy process, reflecting on its impact on my PTSD symptoms and also on my eating disorder recovery progress. I'd like to share this chronicle with others who may be reluctant to embark on this journey without more information about the process and its impact on both conditions. I hope this case study will be a useful resource for researchers, healthcare professionals, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, dietitians, general practitioners, and survivors of trauma who may have developed an eating disorder as a coping mechanism. Are you able to suggest where I should send it to reach an interested audience? So I read through this email and was rather intrigued. As it mentioned, I have had many clients who have suffered with all different types of trauma, and these are often connected either directly or indirectly in them then going on to develop an eating disorder, or if they already had an eating disorder at the time, that it definitely made things worse. And while I was aware of exposure therapy, I'd not come across prolonged exposure therapy and it being used for trauma and trauma treatment. So I had a read through the chronicle and I found it hugely enlightening for me and thought that it would be something that would be useful to share with you guys. So I responded to the email and asked if she would be keen to come on the podcast and talk about her experience with the prolonged exposure therapy and go through some of what was included in the chronicle, and she said yes. So she still wants to keep her identity anonymous, and rather than refer to her as anonymous in the interview, we just picked a letter, K, and used this to refer to her in the show. This podcast is a heavy one, and it comes with many trigger warnings. The podcast contains description of the rape that happened to Kay. She talks about suicidal thoughts and specifics about when these thoughts were at their worst. Kay is also still in the process of recovering from an eating disorder, and she is not recovered. So there were mentions of different numbers, so calories, BMI, number of times she eats or ate each day. And I've actually cut all of these numbers out, and I've cut out some small sections of the conversation that I felt would be inappropriate for many people to hear. And often these cuts can be obvious and somewhat jarring, and like words are missing because words are missing. And eating disorders are so much about comparison, and so I didn't want to fan the flames by keeping this information in when the podcast and the content can still stand up with this information removed. There is also talk about exercise, specifically ballet, which I did leave in, and this is because this is so central to Kay's story. And again, I've removed anything that I felt was unnecessary and not pertinent to the story and could be triggering, but because this is so much the central part of the story, I've left most of it in. So if hearing about trauma or suicide or exercise like ballet, or simply hearing someone who isn't recovered speak about their current experience, and you think that these things are likely to be triggering for you, then please give this episode a miss. As part of the podcast, we go through Kay's upbringing and life at home at the hands of her mother. We cover her ballet, which was a big part of her life and at one point looked like it would be her career. We go through the rape and everything that led up to that day and then the after effects over the next couple of years. We talk about her development of an eating disorder in her late teens and her recovery from this, and then talk about the eating disorder that came back some 20 odd years later. We cover in detail the prolonged exposure therapy and what the 11 weeks of this looked like. But as we go through, it wasn't just prolonged exposure therapy that was of use. There were many other helpful practices that were suggested by her therapist alongside this as part of the recovery process. And as part of this, we have a discussion about the importance of a really strong therapeutic relationship and how important this is for any sort of recovery work. We chat about where Kay is now with the PTSD and also her eating disorder recovery. And we finish up going through the 10 most valuable lessons that she learnt over the last couple of years, which includes her recovery work and the prolonged exposure therapy. We talk about shame and how big a part this is in Kay's experience. And I made reference to a previous podcast that I'd done on the topic, and in the moment when I was chatting, my mind went blank with the name of the guest, the episode I was referencing. So if you're interested, it's episode 227 with Beverly Engel. I also make reference to the film A Beautiful Mind and give some spoiler to the ending. It did come out some 20 odd years ago, so you really have had quite a bit of time to watch it. But if it's on your list and you're going to be pissed that I gave away the ending to the film, then please go and watch the film first, and then you can come back to this episode. The chronicle that was attached to the original email and is the basis for this conversation is going to be included in the show notes. And I think it could be useful to read for someone who is a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a dietitian or someone who is a general practitioner. I would feel cautious for someone who still has an active eating disorder and reading this. And that's because there is a lot of reference to numbers in terms of calories and BMI and numbers of times eating each day that could be triggering and lead to comparison and making things worse. So if you're in the process of recovery, only read this if you are far enough along that these numbers aren't going to have an impact on you. And if that content is going to be triggering, then this podcast should be able to provide you with enough information to then decide if prolonged exposure therapy is something that you want to explore. So that is it for this intro. Here is my conversation on prolonged exposure therapy with Kay. Hey Kay, thanks for joining me on the show today.
It's my pleasure, Chris.
So I guess to start with, do you want to just talk about some of the factors that led up to you developing an eating disorder?
Yes, well, I suppose it started pretty early. When I was 5 years old, I started ballet training, and that saw me through to the age of 16 when I stopped. And the ballet world is, one where it's very easy for body image issues to emerge and poor relationships with food. Like many of my friends, I developed a very unhealthy relationship with food, felt that I needed to earn the right to eat. And so, we had weekly weigh-ins. Our ballet teacher used to tell us how much weight we had to lose by next week. And so, I felt that I didn't really have permission to eat, and my hunger signals were pretty strong, and my body was trying to drive me to eat, but I always very guilty about that. So that continued until I was 16, and at the age of 16 I was dancing professionally part-time, but I was also continuing my high school studies. And, my perfectionism is not limited to ballet training, it was academics as well. And so I had to make a decision about whether I was to continue on in the ballet world or pursue an academic pathway. And the decision was made for me when I was 16 and had a traumatic event that led to a ballet injury. An injury that meant that I couldn't continue doing ballet. And so an eating disorder didn't emerge initially. I just got busy at that point, busied myself with finishing high school and starting university. But about a few months into university, I was pretty much on a rapid descent into anorexia.
And I know you mentioned as well, I mean, just with the ballet piece, it wasn't just the ballet. This was coming from home. I think one of the things you wrote was your mother's search for somewhere where you could learn ballet because she didn't want you to become fat, and that she told you so.
Yeah, I knew that I was going to ballet at the age of 5 because, she was wanting to make sure that I didn't become fat. She'd always had a bit of a unhealthy relationship with food and weight herself. She was very slim. I don't know whether she ever had an eating disorder. It's possible. We don't talk about that kind of thing. But she made it very clear that she didn't want me to be fat. And at various points when I was a teenager, when my ballet teacher would have conversations with her, I was in earshot of the conversations. It was along the lines of, I don't know why she hasn't lost that kilo I told her to lose. What she'd been eating, and my mother would say she hardly eats anything at all, and that they were really colluding to try to get me to, drop down to that sort of magic kilos that I was supposed to be. Yeah, and I was sort of stubbornly stuck. So, yeah, they really, my mum promised her that she would make sure that I wasn't secretly eating more than they thought that I needed. So I felt pretty starved at home, and that I didn't really have permission to eat to fuel my body properly. And, I was burning a lot of energy, 20 hours a week of ballet training in a body that's meant to be growing. So it was an unhealthy relationship with food at the ballet studio and at home, really.
Yeah. And how was that then different when it turned into anorexia? Was it previously it was then being forced upon you, and then when it changed, it was more that you were in the driver's seat?
Yeah, I think when I was anorexic, I think I was punishing myself, and that permission to eat, I didn't feel I had, or you have to earn the right to eat food. You have to be absolutely starving before you can eat. Yeah, I think I was just very unhappy at that point, and I think it's all wrapped up with my definition of what good behaviour looks like, and perfect behaviour and perfect eating, and I had a pretty warped sense of what perfect eating looked like.
Yeah. And so you mentioned in passing about a traumatic event, and I think it would be useful to speak about this in a little bit more detail, just because it is so pertinent to this story and so much a part of what the exposure therapy then was about. So go into this in the detail that you think is relevant for people to hear.
Yeah, it should be easy now after all the telling of the story I've had to do through the 3 months of exposure therapy, but it's still quite difficult to find the words. But yeah, basically when I was 16, I had a boyfriend who was also a dancer, and I went to his house one day after school instead of going to the ballet studio like I did every afternoon. I didn't tell anybody. I basically lied to my parents and the ballet school about where I was. Well, I didn't lie. I just didn't tell them where I was.
Yeah.
And so I went there without anyone knowing, just to spend some time with him. And my parents didn't know about the fact that I had this boyfriend. They wouldn't have approved of him. He was a beautiful dancer, but he made some bad decisions. And one of them was he got himself involved with distributing amphetamines around the ballet school. It was the 1980s, I should say. And this was quite a common thing that dancers didn't really eat. You got by on some speed and an apple, and it was just the scene. And so he was involved in distributing amphetamines, and the drug dealer, he owed some money to the drug dealer. So I was round at my boyfriend's house, and the drug dealer came round to get his money, and it was violent. And I ran out of the house through the park across the street to try to get to the tram stop to get to the ballet studio where I was meant to be. I wasn't even thinking. I was completely running in the wrong direction. I should have been going south, but I was going north to the wrong tram stop. Anyway, I ran through the park, and I didn't realise I was being chased, and he attacked me in the park. And, it's still quite difficult to talk about But basically I was raped and choked and kicked at the end for not saying thank you. And that kick to my hip was the injury that meant that I really had trouble walking. That there was a man walking his dog through the park, and one of my boyfriend's housemates came looking for me, and they helped me back to the house and then took me to the hospital. But I didn't stay at the hospital. I was a bit in shock and freaked out and really worried about I needed to get back to the ballet school for 10 p.m. when my dad was supposed to be collecting me. So I just left as soon as the nurse left the room to go and order some x-rays for my hip. I left. And so I never got any medical support. I didn't tell anybody what had happened, never went to the police. All my friends who knew about what happened never really followed up with me. I never saw my boyfriend again. It was just, I mean, we didn't have mobile phones and people weren't texting each other on Facebook and stuff like that. It was just kind of like you wanted to speak to somebody had to call you on the phone that your parents would answer.
On the landline.
Yeah, on the landline. And basically I just became very isolated. The ballet school asked me and my boyfriend not to return because they didn't want a drug scandal. And pretty much my world, as I knew it, ended that night. And I coped by locking myself in my room, basically. And over the coming months, I mean, it was the end of my penultimate year of high school. Over that summer, I just knuckled down and started to prepare for my final year of high school. And I just did, every day, I did a 3-hour maths practice exam, getting ready for year 12. Like I was doing the year 12 exam, the end of year 12 exam before I'd even started year 12, just to get good at it. And I just used that to occupy my mind and to avoid having to talk to people. I didn't want my family to figure out anything was wrong with me. And I just got really good at maths. So, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And when you went off to university, did the isolation continue on, or you started to branch out a little more and make new friendships?
Yeah, no, I made friends quite quickly and easily. You know, mathematics is a fairly male-dominated field, and the handful of females in a lecture theatre tend to congregate together. So I had a handful of female friends, and, you know, we had lunch and socialised outside of our classes, and they became good friends, 3 or 4 friends there. But, you know, nevertheless, I put on a little bit of weight during year 12. I was probably still underweight, but I put on a little bit of weight with the lack of exercise, and I was a bit too focused on my studies to really do anything about it during year 12. But once I got to university and I had a little bit more spare time in my week, that's where I just sort of made up my mind that I was going to get my ballet body back, and I started exercising more and restricting what I was eating, aiming for that perfect eating thing. And, you know, within the first 6 months of university, my weight had plummeted. My friends were concerned. One of them took me, like begged me to go and see a doctor, came with me. She was waiting in the waiting room, and I went in to see the doctor. And I wasn't ready to admit to him that I had an eating disorder. It was just kind of like, oh, I'm here because my friends think I've lost too much weight. And it's like, well, you know, do you like peanut butter? And I said, I guess. And he said, well, why don't you have a couple of extra pieces of peanut butter on toast for breakfast and come back in 3 months and we'll see if you put on some weight. And I just thought, okay, whatever. That's not going to happen. But, you know, I wasn't about to have a conversation with him about my past trauma or the fact that I wasn't eating properly, that I was deliberately not eating.
Yeah.
So it just kind of got worse.
Did you said at that stage you weren't ready to admit you had any, so did you at least have the presence of mind to know, okay, this is this thing, but I don't want to give it up? Or you were like, I'm just being healthy, in inverted commas, like, how did you think about it?
I don't really remember, but I think I knew that it wasn't healthy.
Okay.
I knew that I was pushing myself too far, but I think I was taking a little bit of pride in my self-discipline. Like, I've grown up with that. I've grown up with this belief that I can only be proud of myself if I'm controlling my weight and eating perfectly and pushing myself. And I had missed that a little bit. I'd missed that in that year off where I had no ballet in my life and I'd just been doing my academic studies. And I think I was enjoying feeling back in control and feeling proud of myself for being disciplined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so with this stage, I know you recovered to some degree. So yeah, what did that look like? How did that come about?
Oh, it took probably 2 years before probably because I met my husband. And I don't know, it wasn't any one particular thing, but I just hanging out with him. Well, he wasn't my husband for about 5 or 7 years later, but I started a relationship with him and he just made me feel, loved and special.
Yeah.
And just slowly I just started to relax a little bit more, be less concerned about what I was eating, start to eat a bit more like him. And, I can't remember what I weighed by the time I kind of came out of that, but I do remember having this kind of freak out moment where I started to eat normally or a little bit more normally, and overnight I would put on like 2 or 3 kilos and it's like, oh my God, I can't do this and I've got to restrict again. And then I just remember getting to a point where it's like, this isn't sustainable. I just need to eat normally.
Yeah.
And sort of giving up weighing myself and things like that. So, yeah.
Would you have then, at the end of that point, would you have thought of yourself as fully recovered, or in hindsight, this was always still lingering there to some low level degree?
It's a really interesting question. I actually, when I look back at that time, I'm tempted to say that I was recovered. By the time we got married when I was 25, by that point I'd got my PhD, had started my job as a lecturer at the university. I don't have any memories of that time of having eating disorder thoughts.
Yeah.
I just ate normally. I remember going out to restaurants and not hesitating to order whatever I felt like, or like a bread basket came around and I'd have a slice of bread, no drama at all. I think I can say that I was recovered at that point.
Okay. And so then there was a relapse. And so talk about that and the things that led up to that occurring.
Yeah, well, I guess it was 20 years later. So, so we got married when I was 25 and I was just busy working my way up the academic ladder. And I had my 2 children in my early 30s, and that was all good, busy mum, working full-time, mother of young children.
Yeah.
I put on some weight during my second pregnancy, not so much the first one, but the second one, I'd had a miscarriage in between the 2 children, and I had blamed myself for that miscarriage. Looking back now, I don't think it was my fault, but early in the pregnancy, I had seen the rapist at a distance on my university campus. I don't have any clue why he was there, but it had freaked me out a little bit, and it was probably the first time in a very long time I'd thought about what happened. Yeah. And I got a little bit anxious and nauseated and things for a while, and I lost my appetite. And so there was probably about a week where I wasn't eating a lot, and I had a miscarriage the next week. And I don't know whether that caused it. I also had a pap smear around that same time, and it could have been that, who knows. But I certainly blamed myself, and I felt very ashamed of the fact that I had not eaten properly. And, I mean, also I was feeling quite nauseated from morning sickness, I think, as well. But yeah. I guess a lot of women early in pregnancy probably don't eat perfectly because they're feeling sick. But anyway, because of that baggage, I blamed myself. And so I resolved, when I was pregnant again a few months later with my son, I resolved that I really need to eat well. And so I did. I ate a lot, motivated by wanting to have a healthy baby. And after he was born, I just got used to eating more. and different types of food and more sort of calorie, energy dense food.
Yeah.
And that persisted, when you have two young children and you're working full time and meetings all day, I'd come home at night and just have like a very large dinner. And the weight that I put on during the pregnancy didn't really drop too much. So I was feeling quite unsatisfied or dissatisfied with the weight gain for about a decade, like until my son was 10. And he got to his 10th birthday and I thought, oh, come on, this is ridiculous. Your youngest child is 10 and you're still carrying this weight that you didn't have before his pregnancy. So I decided to do something about it. And the only thing I know how to do in terms of exercise is ballet. I don't enjoy anything else. I've never been one for team sport or aerobics or anything like that. So I returned to a ballet studio. I found an adult ballet school and I took some classes. And it was a little bit triggering being in a ballet studio. It's a whole world that I left behind a long time ago with a bit of bitterness, really, about the way I grew up and also the way my ballet friends kind of treated me. But it was exercise and I needed to do it. And that was all good for about a year. And the weight naturally fell off a bit just because of the exercise. And then I had a conversation with my ballet teacher, actually, just expressing my gratitude that she's got such a beautiful, welcoming ballet studio and how much I'm enjoying being back doing ballet. But the conversation, she's a really good listener, and the conversation took an unexpected turn, and I found myself confiding in her about the reasons that I gave up ballet when I was 16. And something happened after that conversation. It was just all of that trauma and all of that history that I hadn't thought about for so long just suddenly became in the forefront of my mind.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get rid of it. I went into a depression. I remember that night just sitting there in the dark. I couldn't even be bothered getting up and turning the light on when it got dark. And, literally it was like a dark curtain had kind of descended over my world, and I just felt this weight of depression. And I kept waiting for days and days. I just kept waiting to feel better, but I wasn't. And I wasn't hungry. I'd lost my appetite. I was just ruminating constantly about what happened, just trying to make sense of the past.
Yeah.
And it didn't make sense to me. There was just so much that didn't make sense to me. I'd never really allowed myself to think about it very much. Anyway, within 6 months, obviously I wasn't eating properly, and 6 months later my weight was back in the underweight zone. And, I tried over the next year or so to slowly start eating more. I confided in that ballet teacher friend again that she knew that I had an anorexic past, and I told her that I'm worried that I'm back there again.
Yeah.
And I would check in with her regularly as I tried to drag my calories up. I was tracking on a food app. And I slowly started to eat more, but my weight was just maintaining. At least it wasn't falling anymore. I'd managed to stop it falling any further. But then after about, maybe 9 or 10 months of that, it's so tedious tracking everything and trying to increase it constantly.
Yeah.
I just gave up. The depression was so bad. I was pretty suicidal, like constant suicidal thoughts. I would travel around the world with work. I'd be alone in Stockholm or somewhere. I'd fly over there to give a 1-hour lecture, but the whole experience was like a week out of my life, just pretty much being on my own. You fly such long distances, from Australia to Stockholm. It's like 36 hours where you're not talking to anybody. You've just got your thoughts in your head. And it's quite a lonely experience travelling. And I wasn't eating properly the whole time I was travelling. And, lots of suicidal thoughts in Stockholm and various places around the world. And I reached my lowest point. I remember being in Fiji on I'll say family holiday, but I was invited to be a speaker at a conference, and so they were paying for me to go, and they also paid for my family to go, and it was meant to be a beautiful holiday in an amazing resort in Fiji. And I just really kept fantasizing about drowning myself. And wondering how I could make it look like an accident so that my kids didn't find out that's what I'd done.
Wow.
So that was a really low point at the end of 2018.
And in that moment or even afterwards, was there a presence of mind of, okay, this isn't really me, and that was the thing that spurred you on to then say, okay, I need to get some treatment for this?
I didn't think I needed treatment at that point.
Okay.
I knew that I was at a really low point and that those thoughts were not normal. I didn't get treatment until the start of this year, 2020. Sorry, we're 2021, aren't we?
Yeah.
Lockdown, everything's just a blur. No, I didn't get treatment until the end of 2020.
Okay.
So at the end of 2018, my low point, I did think I could recover on my own. I confided in my daughter, who was at that age 16, and she knew something wasn't right with me.
Yeah.
And I told her finally about my trauma when I was her age. It just sort of came up naturally in a conversation, actually. And I also told her about, my history of eating disorders, not just that she knows right now that I don't eat that much, but I told her about the past eating disorders as well. And she's been amazing. She encouraged me to delete the app from my phone, which was a very difficult thing for me to do, but I allowed her to delete it herself. And then I just, was going solo, just trying to eat what I thought I should eat. And so over a 6-month period, I kind of increased my weight. I increased my weight just enough that I got my period back. And then I felt that I had justified, that's enough now. That's all your body needs. Everyone can get off your case. You've got your period back, and surely that's enough. And I pretty much stayed there for another year, I think.
Yeah.
Eating just enough to make sure I kept having a period, but no more. And I don't know why. There was something stopping me going high, but I just felt that was enough. And it was really only in February 2020, just before all the COVID lockdowns happened, that I had a trip to Vienna with my daughter. And it was a work trip for me, but she also had a music competition that she was performing in coincidentally. So we had a fantastic 3 weeks in Vienna together, no scales. And I just ate like her. I just enjoyed the whole Viennese experience.
Yeah.
And I returned 3 weeks later and I'd put on kilos, and I was quite comfortable with that. I had such a happy time there with her.
Yeah.
Just felt really free. And then, of course, we went into lockdown. And during the first 6 months of lockdown in 2020, I think I put on another kilos just being around the house. And so, so all of that was with no professional support. It was just pretty much my daughter inspiring me and me not wanting to disappoint her. That's a big motivator.
Yeah.
But at the end of 2020, I did reach out for help. And it's really bizarre when I think about it now. All that time where I clearly needed help, I didn't think I did. But it was only when I started eating what I thought was too much that I thought, I need some professional help. I'm binging. And I got terrified that I was developing, just swapped anorexia for binge eating disorder.
And that is so common in terms of the amount of people who, when I'm able to restrict, everything is fine. But it's when I'm now unable to restrict and I'm having binges, or what I deem as binges, that this is now that there's a problem, and this is what needs to be solved.
Yeah, I suddenly felt that I was out of control, and that scared me because I'd always been so in control of everything.
Yeah.
And while I was super in control, even if it was slowly killing me, that wasn't a problem. But as soon as I felt out of control, it's like, I need to talk to somebody to see if this is normal and to see if my recovery for the last 2 years is on track or what's happening. And I kept, looking at YouTube videos and listening to podcasts, and, I'd heard about extreme hunger.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, maybe that's what it is. Maybe I have this urge to eat because of extreme hunger. It can't or is it because I've just got no self-discipline anymore? And you know, all the sort of self-hatred was telling me that I've got no discipline and this is going to be a disaster. You know, you're just going to keep putting on weight forever. So it was a real fear that I'd lost control that made me reach out for help at the end of 2020. And when I look at it now, you know, I know what you're going to say. It's kind of like you restrict for so long, your body fights back.
Yeah.
But it felt like a binge to me because it just felt out of control. And I'm not eating for enjoyment. It's like this primal thing, and it felt scary.
Yeah, definitely.
So I decided I needed some help. Anonymously, I reached out to a eating disorder organisation, and I spoke to a telehealth nurse. I remember going out into the garage of my apartment building and sitting in the car and taking the phone call because I didn't want my family to know that I was thinking about getting help. And I had a great conversation with a lovely nurse who basically made me accept that, you know, there's always that fear that I don't really need help because I'm not really that sick. And so it was just, you know, me just inquiring about whether she thinks my recovery sounds like it's on track. But as soon as I mentioned about that I had this long history of eating disorders and a traumatic past, and I couldn't bring myself to go into the details of what the trauma was. I couldn't even say the word rape back then. That's what prolonged exposure therapy has given me, the ability to say that word.
Yeah.
But I couldn't even tell her what the nature of the trauma was, but she convinced me that I do need to go and see my GP and they will be able to help me. And she told me all about, you know, we're very lucky in Australia. We have very good mental health support, and the GP is able to write either a mental health care plan or an eating disorder plan that entitles you to subsidised psychology and dietitian appointments. So I went and saw a GP who wrote one of those plans for me, and then I managed to see a psychologist and a dietitian who both work at the same clinic that specialise in eating disorders. So that was late 2020 I started that journey.
Yeah. And so then how long before you then came around to doing the treatment for the PTSD?
Yeah, so I think I had about 3 months of psychology and dietitian appointments where, you know, they both knew about that I had a traumatic past and it was from sexual assault when I was 16, but we didn't really talk about the details of that. It was very much around trying to get insights into what restriction is giving me. Why do I do it? Just trying to understand that. And there were some really good insights that I got and good progress that was made. You know, I'd never thought about these things before. It was just the way I manage my life, you know. But it was really useful and little exercises that, you know, I've got some diagrams in the chronicle of the mind map exercise that I had to do just to try to understand the cycles that get created, what restriction gives me and how that keeps me stuck in these thoughts that make me feel like restricting. So that was really useful. But I did start to feel like unless I start talking about the trauma, I'm not really going to unpack some of those issues. So, yeah, I just kind of felt like the trauma is so traumatic that you kind of need to speak to someone who specialises in that kind of thing. And so I started to realise I don't just have an eating disorder, I also have PTSD. The symptoms were pretty clear. My GP recognised that as well. I was having quite constant nightmares, like at least every 2 nights, waking up from nightmares and flashbacks. I was having flashbacks in the ballet studio as well. Every time I felt my hip immobility from the injury, it just reminded me of it, and then I'd be having these flashbacks. I was having a lot of difficulty controlling my thoughts while I was awake, and also apparently while I was asleep. My subconscious was obviously trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
And so the PTSD symptoms were really starting to become quite debilitating, particularly the lack of sleep. I was probably getting 2 to 3 hours sleep most nights. So my GP prescribed some antidepressants, and it's an antidepressant that it's like a melatonin kind of thing. It's supposed to improve sleep quality. But yeah, I just really felt like it was time to address the PTSD.
Well, I mean, so far up until that point, the way you had been addressing it was through the restriction. And you kind of talked about the fact that you would have these flashbacks or these thoughts about the trauma, and then you would, in its place, put the focus on the food. And so I guess when you're then losing that as a tool, it makes sense that you're then having more flashbacks, you're having more nightmares because you're not able to keep a lid on it in the way that you had.
Yeah. And I think skirting around the issue, knowing, like having discussions with the psychologist about my issues, but not really talking about the issues, and yet talking about things like anger and guilt and shame and all these feelings that I have, but not really unpacking any of it.
Yes.
It was there. It was in the forefront of my mind all the time, waiting to be explored, but I didn't know how to explore it. And also when you spend a lot of time thinking about such upsetting things, my appetite gets very easily affected by those upsetting thoughts.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help to be trying to eat properly when you actually feel quite nauseated and upset and anxious. So, yeah, it needed to be addressed. And so I was just lucky that I happened to notice the university that I work at has a weekly staff newsletter thing that goes out where they often have calls for volunteers for research studies, call for participants. And I happened to see just at the right time, I saw a call for volunteers for a PTSD study. And there were a couple of different studies they were doing. One was looking at the effect of exercise or something. And I thought, I don't need to add more exercise in my life. I'm already doing enough of that. But there was another one that was looking at a comparison between prolonged exposure therapy, which is the gold standard, the traditional, well accepted treatment, and another therapy. And you don't get a say in which one you do, you just get randomly assigned. But I filled in the online form, and then I had a phone call with somebody to see whether or not I was eligible. And I told them a little bit about the trauma and the PTSD symptoms. And then they allowed me to join the study, which was fantastic because it was free. And I'd already spent so much money at that point. And it was 10 weeks of prolonged exposure therapy. I had no idea what it was. It sounded very, very scary, but I was kind of desperate at that point and realised that I needed to finally talk about this.
Yeah. And so for people who, and I imagine most people are not going to know what prolonged exposure therapy is, can you just give an overview?
Sure. So it's a process of exposing yourself to the things that you've been avoiding. And I think it comes from a position that says that PTSD is more related to like a phobia, really. So, if you have a fear of spiders, then the idea with exposure therapy is that, first they might show you a picture of a spider and you might sort of gradually get exposed to the spider ideas until you maybe go to the zoo and see one, or eventually you might actually feel comfortable seeing a live spider in the same room as you or something like that. The idea is that we have avoidance behaviours that keep us trapped in PTSD symptoms, and we avoid thinking about things that upset us. We avoid going to places that remind us. And so there's two types of exposures that they do. One is in vivo, in real life. You and your therapist will agree on the things that you could do that would expose you to things that are distressing you, that you normally avoid. So in my case, that was visiting the park where the rape occurred. And then there's also imaginal exposure, which is telling the story over and over again. And every time you tell the story, it's with more and more detail added. And so every week, so like week 0 is just a conversation, get to know your therapist, talk about the background of the trauma and what you're hoping to get out of that. And I was hoping to get improved sleep and, maybe the eating disorder symptoms would subside as well, and maybe just a bit more comfortable with my story and not feeling so ashamed about it was my hope.
Yeah.
And then in week 1, you're still not telling the story yet, really, but it's a conversation about avoidance behaviour, and it's trying to identify what do I avoid, where do I avoid going, and trying to set it up for what would be a useful set of exposures that you could have. So initially I could only identify I definitely avoid going to the park. You know, I'll drive the long way around to avoid going down that road. And I couldn't think of anything else. But in the week following that session, I thought of lots of other things that I do avoid, or things that remind me of the trauma. In particular, things that remind me of being choked, like having someone touch my throat and things like that. There's quite a long list of things that I was able to come up with in the end.
Yeah.
And then you have a week where you set some of those in vivo exposures. You make a commitment of what you're going to do, sort of gradually building up. So at first I didn't have to go to the park. I just had to drive down the road. And then the next time I had to maybe go into the park, but I didn't have to go to the place where it happened. And then, you know, after that I had to go to the place where it happened. And I ended up going to the park about 5 or 6 times. And that was really useful, primarily because it made me remember a whole lot of things that I'd forgotten. But also it made me aware of the fact that I wasn't as upset as I thought I was going to be. And in fact, emotion was quite missing. When I was at the park, I was mostly feeling very analytical. I was noticing lots of things. I was noticing, it's not as far from the busy road as I thought it was. And I was noticing, there's this other path that I could have chosen to go down, but I chose to go down this path. And, you know, just noticing things. And I wasn't that upset. And I later realised it's because I've become so detached from it.
Yeah.
The upset came later. Several weeks later, I was quite emotionally engaged finally. But at first it was a little bit hard to get really in touch with the deepest emotions that I was feeling.
Yeah. And I think, part of when I was reading through it, I think it's the exposure therapy as well is starting to then fill in all of those details. So as you said, you started to remember more and more, and you were able to talk about the story in more detail. And it's in a sense like being able to complete the story and the cycle, because I think for a lot of PTSD, you're seeing flashbacks, or you're seeing moments of it and not being able to, trying to avoid that, and understandably trying to avoid that. But for the human brain to be able to fully process that, and to have it be something like with other upsetting things that happen in our lives with time, and often a lot through sleep, that process of cleaning up the brain, etc., means that is something that then can get catalogued into our memory, but in a different way to the way it is with something with PTSD. And it seems that there's something about being able to tell the full story and really allow that to then be completed. And I think that's definitely one of the things that I noticed when going through what happened over the 10, 11 weeks, was that each time you were just adding in more and more, that we're allowing you to then have a fully rich picture of the experience, as terrifying and as upsetting as that was, to then be able to have it be that full story, as opposed to just those flashbacks.
Yeah, that's right. And it really helped me, filling in the gaps and remembering things that were said and all this kind of stuff. It really helped make sense of what had happened, instead of just having all of this confusing thing that I struggled, I think, in my subconscious times to try to make sense of. It was only when some of those details came and I remembered, things that he said to me or whatever, that you start to piece together explanations and realise that it wasn't your fault and all this kind of stuff. So it was really important to I think, visit the park to overcome that fear, because just being there visually, I saw things that triggered memories that I'd long forgotten. And every week when I told the story again, so the first time I told the story, I think I told it, I can't remember, it's 4 times in 20 minutes or something. There was hardly any detail and I was just in a hurry to get to the end. I skipped lots of bits. But then in one session, you then, you tell it over and over again, and then you have a recording and you have to listen to the recording every day for the rest of that week. And when you tell the story, it's with your eyes shut and you're using the present tense. So you're trying as much as possible to imagine being in that situation again, which is hard. And then every day you're listening to that recording, and every time you hear it, you're thinking, oh, I should have said that. Oh, I forgot about that. And you've got all these more details, extra details that you think, oh, I've got to say that next week. So then every week you tell the story, it takes longer and longer to get through it. And so, as the weeks emerged, maybe I'd only get through telling it twice or 2 or 3 times, and it was taking 45 minutes. But then that's a 45-minute recording you then have to listen to every day. And by week 6, it was all a bit too much. By week 6, I had so much detail in there, and I'd already worked through all the feelings of shame and self-blame. And by week 6, I was starting to feel a little bit of forgiveness for myself once some of those details emerged, and I managed to challenge some of my beliefs and realize that it doesn't make sense to blame myself. And then by week 6, I started to feel anger, not towards myself, but other people, and sadness. And it's a real roller coaster ride of emotions. But eventually you get to the end, and what I can say is that at the end, I think I have a whole lot more self-compassion, and I can think about what happened and see it for what it was, which was I was in the wrong place at the wrong time and something really horrible happened, but I'm okay. And, I don't need to keep dwelling on the past and trying to make sense of it all. It kind of does make sense to me now. So, yeah, it was a very difficult 10 weeks. Actually, it was 11 weeks. They gave me an extra week because I think we both thought that I wasn't going to get out in one piece within 10 weeks. That extra week was good.
Yeah.
And, so I'm so glad that I did it.
Nice. And so, yeah, there's some extra aspects of this that I think would be useful to go through. So there's the SUDS, so subjective units of distress score. Do you want to talk a little about this and how you were using it throughout?
Yeah, so every time you do an in vivo exposure, or every time you're telling the story, you have to record how distressed you feel before you start, at the end of it, but also at the peak. What was the worst you felt? And you and your therapist set up a scale before we start all this, where you understand what a 0 is and what 100 means. So for me, 100 was the distress I felt that night, and 0 is the distress or lack of distress I feel when I'm listening to music or listening to my kids practice their instruments. And we established, what is a 10 for me, what is a 20 for me, all the way through. And so then I've got something to compare to. So the SUDS scores, so the subjective units of distress scale, the SUDS scores, what I noticed was that the peak score for some of the in vivo exposures was no higher than the score before I started. So, the anticipation is sometimes just as bad as the distress you feel. So before I was walking through the park, I felt quite distressed the first time. But actually when I was there, it wasn't much worse. And then afterwards it was a little bit better. And so I noticed that repeatedly. But also week by week, every time you go, the scores are falling. And so the idea is that you keep going, telling the story over and over again and visiting, the distressing locations over and over again until those scores are quite low, because you've become so either desensitized to it or it's just not distressing anymore to tell the story.
And I know, so yeah, I've kind of looked into a little bit of the research on this, but I'm by no means an expert on it, but I know that there's some of the stuff with the SUDS where they're looking at the fact that what's actually more important isn't the decrease in that score, although that can be helpful. It's actually about the response that you have in those moments. So you can have basically having more flexibility. So having more emotional flexibility and cognitive flexibility and behavioral flexibility. So for example, you could have an exposure and you're at 50, and that then makes you feel very rigid and inflexible, and you don't really have many options or feel like you have many options. And then you could have a SUD score again of 50, but in that situation, you feel like you do have many more options. And so from what I can tell, it's not just about that score coming down. It's about that score either coming down, or even if it stays the same, it's the response that you have being able to be changed.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I had very limited exposures that I could do a lot of the time because of lockdowns. So there were some weeks where I was quite relieved I'm not actually able to go to the park this week. So yeah. But yeah, I don't know how many different responses I could have had. It's certainly a relief when you feel those distress scores are getting lower.
Yes.
And there was a time where, I can't remember what week it was, maybe week 7 or 8, I was still having trouble telling the story. There were still long pauses where I was stopping and saying, after about a minute of silence, or just sort of sobbing, I would just say, I can't keep going, I can't keep saying it. And my therapist was so encouraging. But in those long silences, every day that week when I'm listening to the recording, there's like a minute of silence and I was falling asleep. And I would wake up with a jolt when I heard my voice on the recording again. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I don't think you can fall asleep if you're distressed, right?
Yeah.
Your heart's racing and you're panicky. I don't think you can fall asleep. So the fact that I'm falling asleep listening to the recording tells me that I'm getting quite relaxed about this. Or else I'm just really, really tired. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Because yes, you can disassociate and you can start to think about other things if you're trying to avoid, but you're not, as you say, you're not likely in a really distressed situation to just fall asleep.
Mm. There were some other things I did as well over those weeks that helped a lot. And a lot of that was writing letters that I'll never send to people I was angry with, writing a letter to myself at a time where I was, trying to make progress on the self-compassion piece. Those were really critical, I think, in the process. So, I think the prolonged exposure therapy, there's a pretty strict protocol around what the therapist is supposed to do, but there's also enormous flexibility in extra homework tasks that they can set. So the homework isn't just visiting a park. It's writing letters, or it's, experimenting, taking note of times in the day where you feel shame and things, and then discussing those with your therapist at the start of the next session before you then get into telling the story again. So there's a lot of insights that come week by week from some of these extra homework tasks. And I think it's quite a skillful therapist that can really be so creative to think of what's going to help. It's not just sticking to the script. I'm very grateful to the therapist I had and the creativity that she had in coming up with really useful homework tasks.
Definitely. That was one of the things that struck out to me as well, that it wasn't simply about the prolonged exposure. It was all of the components that were there. And yes, the letter writing, it's something I will often do with clients in various forms, whether that's writing a letter to your eating disorder, writing a letter to your body, having your body write a letter back to you. I think there is some real power in doing this. And yes, I think you had one to your boyfriend, to the drug dealer, to your mother, and then a letter to yourself. And the letter to yourself was, you include either some or all. I don't know how long the letter was, but there's a chunk in the chronicle. And to just see the change in you by that stage, and how your perception have changed, how your beliefs have changed. And again, that was in tandem because you had talked about things like shame and self-blame and compassion and sadness and anger and all of these things that were done in conjunction with the prolonged exposure therapy. It's interesting. I've got a client that I'm working with at the moment who this year has been part of the Johns Hopkins experiments that they're doing with anorexia and psilocybin. So psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And so they're doing therapy with psilocybin. But what is interesting, I think that with her, she's had either 3 or 4 or maybe 5 sessions where they use psilocybin. But prior to starting those sessions, she was having weekly meetings with the two therapists for a handful of months. Since those sessions, they're having therapy sessions. There is book recommendations. There's talking about, okay, let's set some goals here, etc. So it's not like it is just the psilocybin that is doing all the work. It's all of these things. And the other piece that I think was really important is just the therapeutic relationship and the relationship that she has with her therapist as part of that, and the relationship that you had with your therapist. Like it wasn't just you turned up and you did this prolonged exposure. Like you were there, you were having this really deep relationship with this person who was supporting you through this.
No, you're right. It's really critical. And, you're sharing such intimate details. It's just fantastic when you feel deeply understood by somebody. So, I mean, in the chronicle, I share the letter that I wrote to myself. I still look at that periodically. Every couple of weeks I'll take a look at it. It's like my little pet talk to myself to keep me on track. But, at the moment I wrote that last sentence of that letter to myself, I say in the chronicle that I went downstairs and cooked dinner for my family, and that was the moment that I just realised that there's nothing stopping me eating the fish that I've just made them. I don't have to have the tofu. I could have the fish. And when I told my therapist that the next week, she cried. And I sort of thought, well, this is how deeply she understands where I'm coming from. That, she understands it's not about the fish. It's about the fact that I took an action from the pep talk I just gave myself. I took an action that was really prioritising self-care, and that this self-compassion thing that we've been working on is actually starting to yield some results.
Yeah. There was a sentence after that where you said, like, when the compassion turns into actions that feel right, then you're taking long overdue steps towards genuine recovery, and it feels amazing.
Yeah, it's the feeling right bit that surprised me. I know there are actions I can take that are technically, self-care, but whether you feel you deserve them or, it's when it feels right that this is what you actually want to do that you really feel that you are making progress.
Yeah. And through then the prolonged exposure, as time went on, like obviously it got more emotional as you added in more detail, and you became more not just detached from it, where you were able to truly experience it. And then as time went on, I think by the final 11th week, you said you were able to say it, and you felt less drained by the end. And it was just so different, obviously so different from the first time round, but so different from when you told that story around week 6, where it feels like that was the sort of peak period of intense emotions connected to it.
Yeah, it certainly got easier. And my best gauge of that, well, apart from the number of tissues I went through and how long it took me to tell the story in terms of how many pauses or, basically pleading not to continue, I've got measures like that it got easier to tell the story. But also at the end of each time I told the story, when we finished, however many repetitions it was, there was usually 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the session for us to have a bit of a debrief. And there were so many weeks earlier on and in the middle of the program that I just couldn't talk. I just felt so emotionally drained, and my therapist would ask me how I'm feeling, and I just couldn't respond. But by the end, week 11, I told the story. There were a few tears, not that many, and we could have a conversation at the end of it. So, I learnt the hard way that you don't schedule Zoom meetings straight after a therapy session. I had some times where I felt so drained, and then in 5 minutes I have a Zoom meeting and I have to have my work hat on and be on, and I couldn't do it. And so, that's a lesson learned. You have to give yourself time to get over these things because it's so emotionally draining. But by the end, I felt like I've had a therapy session, and I'll be fine in half an hour and I can get on with the rest of my day. So that's another sign of progress.
Nice. And so where are you now in terms of the PTSD or the trauma? Does it feel like I just need to give it more time and I'm going to get there? Is there further therapy work that you're going to be doing or you are doing connected to this?
I feel like the PTSD is quite resolved. In fact, in preparing for this interview, I had to read the chronicle again. Last weekend, I had to read it all again because it honestly feels like all of that is so far in the past. It's no longer in the front of my brain. It's like it's been archived where it was supposed to be all along. It's just that I never archived it because I never allowed myself to think about it and process it. And so I was actually thinking, oh no, I have to talk to Chris on Friday, and I might not remember any details because it's like it happened 33 years ago, amazingly enough. And so I really feel like it's such a distant memory now. And my sleep is much better. I still don't sleep fantastically well, but, like 5 or 6 hours a night, it's much better than 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And so I think the PTSD stuff is pretty good. No more nightmares. Can't remember the last time I had a nightmare, whereas it used to be almost every night. And the flashbacks, I wouldn't call them flashbacks anymore. I might see something on the news that reminds me. It's been a difficult year, particularly in Australia. There's been a lot of media coverage around sexual assault and it's almost every day there's something on the news. And so, but I wouldn't say that those are triggering flashbacks for me. So I think the PTSD has really been addressed by this prolonged exposure therapy. The impact of all of that on my eating disorder recovery, I mean, that's the reason I wrote the chronicle. I wanted to document I was being treated with PTSD, but I was wondering what impact it would have on my eating disorder. There was a danger that it was going to make it worse. Talking about all the stuff that I don't normally talk about and where my eating disorder is a coping strategy for all of that. I was scared in the beginning that my anorexia could come back and all the hard work of the last 2 years could really be undone. 10 weeks of therapy, that's I could do a lot of damage to myself in 10 weeks. And that would just take me back to where I was at that low point, really, at least in terms of weight.
Yeah.
And so that's why I documented, because I was curious about the impact all of this would have on my eating disorder recovery. And so I've been very honest in the chronicle about my thoughts around food and eating and control and all these things. And there were some weeks where it was really felt great and I felt quite free. And then there were other weeks where I noticed that I started to panic a little bit and felt the need for control and restriction.
Yeah.
So the outcome, though, of the prolonged exposure therapy, I think because I've managed to get this more self-compassionate perspective, I think the eating disorder, the bully voice has been silenced. When I restrict now, or if I think about restricting now, it's not from trying to punish myself. There's no self-punishment in this anymore. I have a little bit of an issue still with trusting my body.
Yep.
And sometimes I feel like I'm still trying to control too much what I eat because I don't trust my body.
Yeah.
And I have this, still fear of weight gain and things. Since writing the chronicle, I have recognized that. I've recognized, in my letter to myself, I talk about the need to control, and that when the objective of that control is self-punishment, that's really harmful, right? Yeah. But you can control to feel safe, but then at some point you have to recognize that you can let go of that control and you'll still be okay. Yeah. Well, that's the point. That's where I'm at the moment. I'm not controlling to harm myself. I'm controlling to feel safe, and I'm working on trusting myself that I don't need to do that and I'll still be okay. So about, 6 weeks ago maybe, I did a little food experiment. For 3 weeks, I experimented with my hunger signals. And I've learnt from that process that I can't trust them. My hunger signals are pretty dodgy, and they're easily suppressed by exercise. And so I did some experiments. Unfortunately, it involved using the app to track, and that's a trap for me. I recognise that, but I wanted to get some data. And being a mathematician, well, I'm embarrassed to say I went so far as to build a mathematical model to predict how long it would take me to feel hungry based on the macro balance and the calories of what I ate. And I got a very accurate mathematical model. I can predict to within 15 minutes of when I'll be hungry. And to do that, I had to force myself to eat a variety of different meals. In those 3 weeks, I ate much more variety than I normally would. Yeah. I experimented with different things. I tried to do, a brunch that was fat heavy or protein heavy or carb heavy on different days. So I got quite creative in trying to come up with what I could eat that would be, predominantly fat, like macadamia nuts and avocado on a muffin and these kinds of things. So it forced me to explore more diverse meals than I normally would have. And I quite enjoyed that. That's persisted. I've now got much more variety of foods that I'm willing to eat. But, yeah, I learned a lot of lessons from that food experiment. And so, yeah, I've changed the way that I'm eating since the chronicle was finished. And I acknowledge that I struggle a little bit to trust my hunger signals, but I just take that knowledge and say, well, okay, you don't feel like eating after you've just done a ballet class, but your body needs to refuel anyway, so just have something. Don't wait for the hunger signals. And also I've realised that I don't have to wait until I'm absolutely ravenous before I deserve to eat something, that it's okay to eat something even if I don't feel starving yet.
And I think that's the real issue when you've been in a place where you have truly been so hungry. Like there is no way that you can say, okay, this isn't hunger, like where it just smacks you in the face, to then go to a situation where you are eating more food, you are eating more regularly. You can get to a place where it feels like, well, I just never feel hungry, because what gets cataloged as hunger is this really intense, extreme experience, and everything less than that is just not hunger. And so when I'm working with clients, in the beginning, a lot of it is having to eat when you're not noticing your hunger, but starting to build up a list of all the things that clients can start to know. And I have a handout that I give to clients of like hunger signals, and some of them are the kind of obvious growling stomach or pit in the stomach, but most of them have nothing to do with that. It can be, I'm feeling more irritable, I'm having trouble concentrating, I'm getting a headache, I'm getting cold hands and feet or tip of my nose. And so there's this long list that clients can start to pay attention to and notice, okay, well, I don't feel hungry in the sense of what I remember hunger used to feel like or what I associate with hunger, but I am actually feeling a number of these things that would indicate that actually my body does need energy. And I mean, the other one is looking at the various symptoms that someone's getting. And so if you're having any inability to sleep through the night, or you're urinating in the night, that's a fairly good indication that your body's not getting the energy that it needs, even if you're not getting obvious hunger symptoms. And so I think the using hunger as a guide is something that has to be like relearned how to do. And hunger is a really subtle thing once you've actually broken that. Like for someone like myself who's never had an eating disorder, if you ask me how I know I'm hungry, it's kind of hard for me to pin it down because it's quite vague. And I can point to certain things, but it's just like, I don't know. I know what it feels like, but I haven't messed with that. And I think once you've messed with it, it then becomes more difficult because you're then analytical and you're trying to like really know. And because the fear is I don't want to gain weight or I don't want to eat too much, there's this feeling of like I have to be absolutely certain here. And hunger isn't absolute certainty in the way that most people feel it, because there is just this, you don't second guess it. You're like, oh, cool, I got this feeling, I know it's hunger, and I just go and eat.
That's right. I mean, when you've messed with it, and then you've got binary thinking as well that tells you that you're either hungry or you're not. Like, there's no shades of grey here. I'm very confident that I recognise what hunger feels like in the late morning. Like, if I don't eat till 11, I'm convinced that is hunger, and you should eat now. But how hunger feels to me later in the day is completely different, because it's not that empty feeling like an overnight fast. And it's very easy for me just to say, well, I'm not hungry yet. And so that food experiment was really interesting, because it forced me to be looking at the clock and saying, well, my mathematical model tells me I should have been hungry after 4 hours, but I'm not. Or am I? I'm not, according to my definition of ravenous overnight fast feeling. But are there some other signs here that maybe I am hungry? And the other thing I discovered is, if I just eat anyway, then I discover actually I am hungry. Sometimes you just eat that first mouthful of food to convince yourself you are hungry. But unless you have it, you can easily tell yourself that it's not time yet.
Yeah.
Then before you know it, having conversations with your dietitian about why you can't eat more than calories in a day. And it's like, well, because I'm not hungry.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I would imagine there are lots of signals your body is giving you all throughout the day that you're hungry, and they just get ignored, or they don't get catalogued as hunger, or they are so constant that they have now just become background noise. And this is the problem for so many people when they are in that place of energy debt. You can have a meal and some of the hunger symptoms never go away, because you still haven't dealt with all the debt that is there. And so I think hunger, as I said, it's a learned skill that you have to relearn because of it being broken.
Yeah.
And there's points at which it's never going to work properly, because you're just in the level of debt that you're in, and you need to get out of that place first before it works. Because for most people, you get hungry because your body is has gone into some energy debt because you finished a meal, and you've then used that energy. You then eat a meal, and then you get back into energy balance or energy surplus for a while, and then you're kind of always at that point where you're a little bit in debt and then a little bit in surplus. But when you're just in this gigantic debt, that doesn't work so well, and so the feedback that you get, even when you finished a huge meal and you're physically full, your body's like, yeah, but there's still debt here. And so, yes, you get into a situation where hunger is just not a reliable indicator at that point as to the amount of food that you need.
Yeah, so that's where I'm at the moment. I'm relearning how to feel hunger and how to eat for enjoyment. My kids are helping me with that a lot.
Nice.
They eat for enjoyment. They haven't been messed up, and I'm trying to learn from them.
Awesome. And so the final thing, I mean, there was like 10 mindset shifts that you mentioned that have made the difference for you, that you noticed as part of going through this. And you said some of it was you'd explored earlier with your psychologist and your dietitian, and then some of it came as part of the prolonged exposure therapy. I'm quite happy to read them out, or if you remember them, I'm happy for you to go through them. But I just think these were really, I think, useful to hear in terms of revelations for you to come to. And I think they're in a lot of senses fairly universal if someone has had A, an eating disorder, or B, has dealt with trauma.
Yeah. Well, I've got the list in front of me here. Yeah. So for me, these were mindset shifts that when I look back, I don't think I would feel like recovery really began unless these had happened. So the first was that understanding of what restriction does for me, why I do it, why I keep doing it, but also what it takes from me. And so the mind map that I created, that it shows the sort of limiting thoughts and beliefs that create cycles that keep me coming back to restriction as the solution.
Yeah.
But, that provided some clarity. But how to break those cycles, that's the question. You've got to tackle those thoughts and beliefs that have been so ingrained. but also realizing that food restriction is not actually the solution. It's the problem. It's not the solution to feeling in control. It makes you feel out of control when your body fights back, and your body will fight back because it's the body that's in control, not your mind. And you have to somehow learn to listen to your body and believe that your body knows what it needs. And if you undereat too many days in a row, it will make you overeat on like day 5 or 6. And if you eat too much, too many days in a row, you know, your appetite will decrease and everything will balance out in the end. You know, you have to trust that. That's what I'm working on at the moment is convincing myself that that's true with my body, with little experiments, and I'm believing it's true.
Yeah.
Another breakthrough for me was a conversation I had with my dietitian where at that moment, it was before I started prolonged exposure therapy, but I was stuck on the idea that calories is really all I need. My evidence for that is that my weight has been stable for 12 months and I do calories. So therefore that must be all I need. My metabolism has slowed down to the point where that's all I need. And I wanted to get her advice about how I could hack my body to slowly increase the number of calories that I could eat, but not gain any weight. And she said to me, "You're asking the wrong question. You need to be asking why you're so scared of gaining weight, not how you can eat more and still weigh the same." And she made me realise that the only reason I track things or that I care about weighing myself and monitoring calories is because I think that tells me whether I'm okay, in control. Okay meaning in control. But those numbers don't tell me whether I'm okay. Clearly I wasn't okay at that point. And there are many more other important indicators that I should be monitoring if I want to monitor things, like my sleep quality, like my relationships, like my energy levels. And so she really encouraged me to start tracking, since I like to track things that matter. Don't track how many calories or you're eating or what you weigh. That's not going to tell you if you're okay. Pay attention to the other things that really are telling you, you know, how's your mood, how are your relationships, and how's your sleep, and those things. And so in the chronicle, I have a model that I developed called the presence model. It's an acronym for all the things that you should care about. And you know, every day I just write down the word presence, and then I put little ticks or crosses under each the letters. It takes me, 30 seconds to assess how I feel today. And how many ticks I get, that's kind of like my indication of whether things are moving in the right direction. And it's much more important than what I weigh.
And I'm going to steal this from you. Like I saw that and I was like, I really love this presence scorecard. And I do it already in a more informal way of when I'm having consults with clients, checking in of different things and asking about, okay, how is your sleep? How are you in terms of seeing people? How are you in terms of being in the present moment and all of this? But having that scorecard, I thought was a really nice way of doing this in a quick fashion.
Good. You're very welcome to use it. There's no copyright. and my whole aim is that other people benefit from the journey that I've had. So that would be wonderful. The fourth little breakthrough realization was recognizing that, it was when we started talking. So I started therapy and we talked about avoidance behaviors. And I had this realization that in the middle, so I'd woken up in the middle of the night with a nightmare and I was lying in bed for hours and I couldn't sleep. And I started, I was thinking about all the unpleasant thoughts and from the trauma. And then my brain switched to starting to plan what I was going to eat the next day. And I noticed this sense of relief that I was thinking about something different and something enjoyable to think about. And I didn't want to go back to thinking about the trauma. And it's because we just had this conversation about avoidance behaviors that I thought, oh my God, don't tell me that whenever I start planning food for the next day, that I'm just busying my brain with stuff to avoid thinking about something that I was just thinking about. And I started to see it for what it was, that my obsessive thinking about what I can eat that's going to satisfy all of my rules. And there's so many rules. And then, I meet my dietitian and now there's more rules because now I've got to eat this many more calories and I still want to have the perfect macro balance and there's not enough time. It's all too much. Yeah. All these rules create this puzzle, this daily puzzle that's impossible to satisfy. Even as a mathematician, I can't satisfy it, but it's a distraction to think about, and I quite like thinking about it. I think if it's a choice between that and thinking about something that's upsetting. So I recognised that at the time that we were talking about avoidance behaviours, and I just sort of thought, that's what I'm doing. That was really interesting.
Yeah, it kind of makes me, the film A Beautiful Mind, do you remember that film?
Yeah.
where he...
Not all mathematicians are crazy, That's
No, I get that, but it just... the way that, he had paranoid schizophrenia, and he then believed he was being hired by the CIA to do this important work, and he had this shed at the back of his house, and when he went into the shed, it felt like there were all these people in there, and he was doing all this work, and then if someone else went in there, they could just see that there were all these bits of paper stuck on the wall and bits of string connected to it, and it was just the realization for him that this was all in his mind, and that this wasn't actually a true reality, that this was just something that was going on in his mind. And I think what was really interesting as part of that film is he had that realization, and then those characters and the people that he would see, they didn't completely go away. So they would always be there, but they would then be in the background, and he was able to then see them for what they are. And I think that this is also true a lot with recovery, in that it's not that this will completely cease and you'll never have any of these thoughts. I mean, often that it feels like that because they do drift so far into the background. It's just that when they come up, you are so unattached to them that it is the equivalent of him walking through a park and seeing them in the distance, and just knowing that I don't even have to pay attention to them. Yeah.
And, these rules, they're of my own creation. There's a set of rules that I've made up and I keep adding to, and it just makes it harder and harder to come up with a solution.
Yeah.
And, it's not just intellectual distraction for fun. It's all about control, but it's recognising that it is just a distraction from things that matter more.
Yeah, and it's not true control. Like it's control only if you narrow your view to these handful of things, while so many other areas of your life are falling out of control. So it's kind of a semblance of control when actually you're very much lacking in control. Yeah.
Anyway, and then the other remaining mindset shifts really came from the prolonged exposure therapy experience, the actual processing of the trauma, visiting the location and telling the story over and over again to get enough details that actually changed my perspective about the role that I played, whether I was to blame, and any shame I feel. It didn't hold up anymore once I remembered some facts. But at the time, when I hadn't processed it all and I was feeling so guilty about the fact that I had lied to my parents about even having a boyfriend, and the fact that I was there, there's all that guilt and shame attached to being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you tell yourself that therefore you deserve what happened next. But, I didn't deserve what happened next. Yeah. So it wasn't until you tell the story. And the other thing is that, being a parent now of teenagers has maybe the time is right now for me to reflect back on that story from a parenting perspective, a self-parenting perspective, and to realise that I would never have blamed my children for if something like that happened to them. Why do I blame myself for what happened to me? Sometimes, those sort of punishing thoughts can be replaced with more self-compassionate thoughts, and you can challenge your beliefs when you view it from the perspective of someone else.
And that's something on one of the other podcasts that I've recorded. It was with a guest, and we were talking about shame and the shame that comes about connected to childhood abuse, whether that be sexual abuse or violence. And one of the things that she had noticed was that there's a feeling that you are so much older at the point that it happens. And so even if you're a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old, there's this feeling that, as you talked about, like you could have done something better or you should have done something different or whatever. And actually saying to someone, hey, spend some time with some 6-year-olds and think about if you think they should have the presence of mind to be able to do the things that you're talking about. And the same with you, being able to see your 6-year-old children, 16-year-old children, and being like, okay, like now I'm getting some perspective of what it is truly like to be a 16-year-old again. I've kind of forgotten. And yes, if that was something that happened to them, there's no way that I would have been blaming them.
Yeah. Yeah, and also recognising the tendency you have to assume, particularly when you've grown up, maybe in a violent household, that if someone's hurting you, you must have done something wrong.
Yeah.
That was another realisation I had, that, you know, I grew up believing that I deserved whatever punishment I got. Even if I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong, I must have deserved it. And so, you know, whether it's a parent or, you know, a rapist in a park, recognising that when someone's treating you badly, it doesn't mean that's what you deserved. It actually says more about them than me. That was another kind of breakthrough moment for me in this journey. And, yeah, and the other realisations I had, or opportunities that the prolonged exposure therapy gave me, was just the opportunity to talk about it so much that it becomes easier to talk about, and so then you can confide in other people and benefit from support. I've told more people what happened to me, with varying levels of detail, in the last year than I have in my whole life. And, you know, when you've been so lacking support and feeling isolated, it's really beneficial to feel comfortable enough telling the story that you can access more support.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the final realisation was realising, you know, just like when I ate the fish and it was fine, choosing that to loosen control a bit and start living with a bit more freedom, taking action to honour that intention to live with more freedom, and noticing that everything was fine, actually. It's okay to loosen the reins a little bit and notice that you're not out of control. Nothing feels more out of control than trying to control everything too much.
Yeah. I would take the word "a little bit" out of that sentence.
Yeah.
But yes, I completely agree. And I think it's great that you've had these 10 realizations, and I'm really glad that you've written this chronicle and that you sent it over and reached out to me, because I do think it is really helpful and will be helpful for people to be able to listen to this podcast, but also read it. I mean, I know for me as a practitioner, it was helpful to read through and learn stuff that I didn't know before. And so, yeah, I'm really, really grateful that you've done this.
Oh, thanks, Chris. I sent it to you because I heard your podcast episode where you were talking about that book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Sure.
And so I know you have an interest in the kind of intersection between sort of PTSD type things and eating disorders.
Yeah, and I would say with the clients that I work with, it happens pretty frequently that there is some trauma or multiple traumas that are connected to the eating disorder, whether that be directly or indirectly. And so I think, as I talked about in various podcasts around this topic, I think this is a lot more prevalent than people know, because as with you, this was a secret that you kept for so long that nearly everyone in your life would have had no idea that this is what happened. And that's the case with so many people where this happens. And so I think it can be so isolating, because there is this feeling of, this just happened to me, no one will understand, no one else has been through this. And the reality is that actually lots of people have had these kinds of experiences and they're just not talking about it.
Yeah, and I know, I mean, as I mentioned at the start of the chronicle, I know it's an open question in the research community about what is the best way treat people that have both PTSD and an eating disorder as a result. Should you treat one before the other, and if so, which one? Or is it possible to treat them both at the same time? And I guess I was curious about that. I had a go at treating the eating disorder and ignoring the PTSD, and then it was like, well, let's try and treat the PTSD and see what happens to the eating disorder. And I really do believe that it helped the PTSD for sure, and I can see lots and lots of benefits for making good progress with the eating disorder recovery as well.
Yeah. In your N=1 experiments,
that's right.
It did feel like that, doing this somewhat concurrently, because I don't know how much it felt like you put the eating disorder recovery on hold while you did this, but yeah, it did feel like that, as you said, the dealing with the PTSD was critical to you then being able to make steps forward with your eating disorder recovery. And so the thought of doing this after eating disorder recovery, in your case, from how you've written about it, I don't think that would have happened.
Well, I think the eating disorder recovery during this process benefited because I resolved to eat 3 times a day.
Yeah.
I didn't think about anything else in terms of eating disorder steps I could take apart from making sure I didn't go backwards. But because the prolonged exposure therapy achieved this more self-compassionate perspective, I think everybody suffering from an eating disorder would probably benefit from more self-compassion. It's probably missing in everyone. And so, the eating disorder stuff benefited from an improvement in self-compassion.
Yeah. And I also think that if you can go through a moment of or a many weeks of huge distress and your eating doesn't get any worse, like that is improvement in an eating disorder, because in any other setting it regresses and things get worse. And so yes, while it may have felt like that was standing still because the intake wasn't going up, I actually see that as a real improvement.
Yeah.
So look, thank you so much, Kay, for doing this and coming on the show. I'm going to put the chronicle in the show notes, and for people who want to read more about it, they can. I would highly recommend it. If you're someone who is suffering with an eating disorder and you have trauma in your history, then I do recommend giving it a read, because I think you'll find some really useful information in there. I know when you wrote each of the descriptions for each week's, that was where you wrote that at the time. And so it's like, how you feeling at the time, like this hasn't been done all sort of retrospectively. And so I think it was nice to be able to see how those things shifted as you went through the weeks. But yeah, is there anything I didn't go through or we didn't chat about that you would love to get to cover before we close up here?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive, Chris. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the chronicle part, the week by week, it's honest, warts and all, how I was feeling each week. And it did change over time, but I didn't go back and edit it because I think it is useful for people to see what the reality was.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I'm hugely appreciative.
That's my pleasure, Chris.